Hey everyone, welcome back to I Heart Movies. My name is Jonathan North, and to kick off season 3, I wanted to try something a little different. This won't be a regular conversational podcast with a co-host. I'm here alone, and I want to talk about all the movies I saw in 2020. I actually wanted to have this up a few days ago, but there was a death in the family, and that kind of delayed things since we had to travel across the state. But I'm back, and this is not going to go up on a Monday. I said originally I wanted to try to get I Heart Movies episodes up every other Monday, but I think I'm just going to settle for every other week, and if it ends up being on a Monday, great, and if it ends up being a few days later, I guess that'll have to work. Sometimes things just can't be helped. So, for this episode, I wanted to go back to something I'd done in previous years, which is one of the first things I did for the podcast in the new year was to do a top 10 list of favorite movies of the previous year, or a best of podcast where I talked about a bunch of different things. All with different guests, we presented our list and talked about each of our choices. And this year, since I'm focusing more on every version ever, instead of finding a co-host for this one, I figured I'd just give you a ranking of all the movies I saw in 2020 from worst to best. And 2020 was a very light year for new releases. Plus, I still have a bunch of titles I haven't seen yet, and I don't really have time to completely catch up, so I figured if I do this episode by myself, I won't feel the need to binge watch a ton of top-rated 2020 releases at the beginning of the year before I record with someone. I did that last year, and that pretty much consumed my entire January. Yeah, I watched a lot in January, and I didn't have time for that this year. So I actually only have 17 movies on my list. I could have sworn I saw more, but then I remembered a lot of the movies I saw last year back at the beginning of the year were 2019 films since I was catching up, especially the ones that I could still see in theaters. So it only feels like I saw more than I did because a bunch of those don't count for this list. So, with only 17 movies to talk about, there's probably going to be some of you who are going to be shocked at the number of films I haven't seen yet, but I figure this is me being authentic. The movies I'm going to talk about are mostly movies that I made a priority to go out and see, so I feel that's kind of a better representation of me in real life, rather than me trying to binge watch for content. And I do intend to catch up on the movies I missed. I just have a lot going on IRL, and I'm really focused on future podcast episodes, so I don't have time for that many extra movies if they aren't going to be the subject of a discussion. I'm actually lucky to keep up to date on the 3 TV shows that I try to watch every week. And for those of you wondering about animation, I definitely intend to catch up on what I missed, and I will do an iHeart animation ranking for 2020, and I will have a co-host. I just need to find time to watch all the films I'm still missing. But this way, even though you'll know the general ranks of some of my choices, at least the big ticket releases listed here, the animation podcast episode will still be completely different because I do intend to catch up on a lot more before we record that one, for better or for worse. So there will be a lot more in that episode that I won't be covering here. Now before we get onto my list of things I did watch, let's quickly go over some of the movies that I haven't watched that I either really want to watch or intend to watch in the future. This list is in no particular order, but I'll first mention 2 that aren't on my list that I probably will eventually watch, but at the moment I'm not super excited about them. First, the live-action remake of Mulan, and then Artemis Fowl, another Disney movie. I was really looking forward to both of these until the reviews started coming out, and then they were no longer a priority. But I still probably will watch them eventually, just not anytime soon. Now for the movies I have not yet seen, but definitely will, these are all ones that I actually can't believe I haven't seen yet, I just haven't had time. New Mutants, Hamilton, Birds of Prey, Personal History of David Copperfield, Palm Springs, First Cow, Enola Holmes, Weathering with You, Over the Moon, and Wolfwalkers. And those last 3 I absolutely will watch before I do my 2020 animation ranking, along with a few other animated films that I'm not looking forward to quite as much, so you'll get my thoughts on those eventually. And then I have a few other films that I've heard good things about. Some are just movies that lots of people were talking about that I want to see what all the fuss is about. Some just looked interesting, and these are all ones that I plan to see eventually. They just won't be as much of a priority as the ones I just mentioned above. And those are The Wolf House, Howard, Jingle Jangle, Save Yourselves, Minari, Tenet, The One and Only Ivan, and Call of the Wild. I'm sure there are more that I'm forgetting, but oh well. Anyway, let's get on to what I have seen. So for this ranking, I'm going to be using the list that I made throughout 2020 on Letterboxd. I love Letterboxd, especially the ranked list features. If you're a movie fan, I highly recommend getting an account there. It's really fun. It lets you catalog movies you've watched throughout the year. You can review them, make random lists. It's very versatile, but I've been using them since 2016, before I even started YouTube. I reviewed a few things, and I mainly use them to keep track of movies that I watched throughout the year and rank them from worst to best. And sometimes I look back on my early lists and I just shake my head like, What was I thinking? I was so lenient back in those days. Basically, if a movie entertained me, it was like an instant 5 stars. X-Men Apocalypse was 5 stars. I think I've demoted it since, but that was my level of film criticism back then. And I'm not fully bashing Apocalypse. I still think it's a fun popcorn movie. Just probably not 5-star worthy. Anyway, on to my list, starting with the worst. And when I say worst, my worst are mostly not even that horrible. Because I'm not a professional critic, I don't feel compelled to see everything. I don't see as many movies as possible for my channel. And I don't purposely see movies that I know I'll hate. Some of my worst films may end up being squarely in the middle of someone else's list, simply because I tend to only watch things that I'm looking forward to. So if something I find is bad, it's probably something that I was looking forward to and was disappointed by. Case in point, my worst film of 2020 was Vivarium. And this was a sci-fi movie, maybe horror film. It had shades of both, but it was about a couple who are looking to move into a suburban neighborhood, but they soon find themselves in this maze of identical houses with no way out, and they have no way to call for help. Eventually, they end up staying in one of the houses, and then a baby shows up that they're forced to raise their own. And then it starts aging really quickly. It looked really weird. The trailer looked creepy in a good way. I was really looking forward to it. But I was expecting a really interesting mystery, something in the vein of Twilight Zone. And I don't really know what I got, except I did not like it. The acting was good, but the mysteries were not solved to my satisfaction, and it did not have a good ending. And I don't know why I was expecting a good ending, but I was. And when I got what I got, I didn't like it. I guess it was Twilight Zone-y, because sometimes Twilight Zone episodes don't have happy endings either. So I guess in that respect, it was par for the course, but I wanted definitive answers, and I didn't feel like I got that, and it had a bad ending, so that was my worst film of last year. My next worst film, which is only slightly better, is Dolittle, the Robert Downey Jr. starring adaptation of Hugo Lofting's Dr. Dolittle books. And I was really looking forward to that movie when I first heard about it. I grew up reading Dr. Dolittle. I loved the original movie from the 50s. But then the reviews started coming out, and I ended up not going to see it. But I was sent a copy to review for the Rotoscopers, so I did end up watching it. And yeah, the reviews were pretty spot on. This was not that great of a movie, not awful, but definitely not good enough for a rewatch. And there was way too much childish bathroom humor, and that's like one of my biggest turnoffs for a movie. I can stand a little bit, but if it's populated with a lot of it, and it's not clever at all, no. It instantly demotes the movie for me, and there was some pretty egregious bathroom humor towards the end of this movie. I was not thrilled. Next up, we have The Willoughbys. This one I've already reviewed for my channel. This was an animated film about a family of neglected and abused kids who really wished they were orphans, and they try to make that happen for themselves. I reviewed this last year on my YouTube channel for my quarantine review series, and I still feel the same way as I did back then. This is another kind of disappointing film. I was expecting like a dark fantasy in the same vein as a Roald Dahl book or The Series of Unfortunate Events, and it sort of was. It just was not as good as those. Not at all. At least in my opinion. Some people love this movie, but I just thought it was fine. It had great animation, great voice acting, but overall not super fun or memorable for me. Next up, we've got Sonic the Hedgehog. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the trailer that launched 1,000 memes, and an angry fan campaign, which resulted in the film being pulled off the schedule and the CGI completely overhauled. And I really did not know what to expect after that fiasco. And for those of you who don't know, this movie is based off the video game series of the same name, about a blue hedgehog that runs really fast and fights evil. I don't think I've ever actually even played that game, or any game in the series, but I loved the animated series when I was a kid, so I was actually interested in this movie. And it ended up being fine. Decent story, decent acting. Jim Carrey was back in form, back in his, 90s self. And Ben Schwartz's Sonic, that was fun. Overall, I had a good time. It's not high on my list, but I'd watch it again. And following that, we have The Christmas Chronicles 2. This is the sequel to a film I covered with Ashley, the movie oracle, at the end of last year, and I watched it in preparation for recording a second episode with her, which we haven't recorded yet, but we're still planning for it sometime. So I won't get too much into the plot here, but I will say it was another fun film, totally watchable, which, as someone who is not usually a big fan of Santa movies, I feel like that's pretty good praise, coming from me. Then we've got Godmothered. This was a Disney Plus film starring Jillian Bell as a fairy godmother in training who goes to Earth in search of a little girl who needs her help, only to arrive decades too late and instead finds a middle-aged single mom. This is actually a pretty fun movie. Kind of along the same lines as Enchanted, the Amy Adams film from a few years back. A fairy tale fish out of water character forced to adapt to modern day life in the big city. I really enjoyed this one. I'd totally watch it again. A lot of fun. And before we get to my top 10, number 11, surprisingly low, we have Pixar's Onward. Now, a low-ranking Pixar film is by no means a bad film. It just means that this one wasn't up to the level that Pixar usually hits. The story is set in a magical fantasy land populated by elves and orcs, mermaids, and unicorns, but they all live in kind of an alternate version of the 1980s. The two main characters here are a pair of elf brothers who lost their dad at a young age, and they're given the chance to potentially bring him back for one day. And I enjoyed this film. I would totally rewatch it anytime. It just wasn't as good as other Pixar films, which is fine. Even Pixar's worst films aren't at all bad, so even though this didn't crack my top 10, I'd still recommend it. Now, before we get to my top 10 films, I should say that I think in a normal year, several of these films would probably be ranked a bit lower. There were so many films delayed due to the pandemic last year that if they had been released, I'm sure a lot of them would be on this list. There were no Marvel films, Disney delayed a bunch of things, A Quiet Place 2 was never released. I know there would have been films that would have pushed out some of my top 10. So in a normal year, a bunch of these would be relegated to lower tiered rankings, but there's a pandemic, so gotta take what you can get. Okay, in spot 10 we have My Hero Academia Heroes Rising. This is the sequel to a film I saw a couple years ago based on an anime series that I have never seen. I mean, I think I've seen like part of an episode at my friend's house, but other than that, I have not watched this anime. There's another superhero film. It follows the students of a school for superheroes as they are forced to fight evil and save an island from supervillains. It's chock full of awesome superheroic supervillain battles and a lot of superhero powers that I've never seen anywhere else, so it's really creative as well. And I think it was Rachel Wagner who actually got me into this. She talked them up on her channel, otherwise I probably wouldn't have gone to see either. And she said you really didn't need to have watched the show to get into the movies, and she was right. I really had no idea who the characters were, but there's enough introduction, and you kind of get to know who they are as you get going in the movie. The animation and action was amazing. It's just a totally fun watch. I'm sure I would have had a deeper appreciation for them if I'd seen the anime series, but if you can watch a movie based on a series you've never seen and still have a great time, I think that says something about the quality of the film. In spot 9, we have Trolls World Tour, another film I reviewed on my channel last year. This is the sequel to DreamWorks Trolls, and this is a rare case where the sequel completely and totally surpassed the original. I did not really love the original Trolls film. It was fine, but I probably wouldn't rewatch it. But I would totally watch this one again, and I have. I think I got this one to review from the Rotoscopers, and I've rewatched it more than once since. It's just really fun. The music is fun, the animation is great, and I love the crafty felted designs of everything. It's just really creative. Even though I didn't love the original, I thought the designs were its strong point, and this one just took that and made everything 20 times better. For number 8, we have Wonder Woman 1984, and for some reason, a lot of people were really harsh on this one, but I really liked it. The sequel to the 2017 Wonder Woman film, I thought it was fun. Gal Gadot was great as Princess Diana. They brought in Kristen Wiig as Cheetah. Yeah, the CGI on Cheetah was a little iffy, but she was human for most of the film, and I thought she was great. And yes, this one did not have the gravitas of the original, but it was a comic book movie, so at the end of the day, I went in wanting to have fun, and that's what I got. So I'm not going to complain, even though I know people had issues with this one. I liked it. For number 7, we have The Croods: A New Age. This is the long-awaited sequel to the 2013 DreamWorks film. This is about a family of cavemen who live in a fantastical world filled with completely made-up creatures. I was one of the few people who absolutely loved the first one, so I've been waiting for a sequel for so long, and thankfully this did not disappoint. I'm just happy we actually got this movie because this film was originally canceled in 2016. It was then revived a year later, so it's had a bit of a rough go. Thankfully, it's done really well for itself, probably helped by the fact that it's one of the few theatrical films in the second half of the year. One of the only family films, for sure, so audiences were probably hungry for something fun to do with their kids. I thought this was a totally worthy follow-up to the original, so it comes highly recommended for me. At number 6, we have Timmy Failure. This was another Disney Plus film, and it was actually in my top 5 for most of the year. This is a really sweet little family film based on a book by one of my favorite cartoonists, Stephan Pastis. It follows a boy detective as he has strange misadventures around Portland, Oregon, with his pet polar bear. If you want an in-depth review, this is another one I reviewed last year. But suffice it to say, this is a great movie and one you can definitely enjoy with the whole family. If you have Disney Plus, give this one a shot. And now we come to my top 5. After this, I think most of the movies here would have been in my top 10 films of the year, even in a non-pandemic year. Maybe not in this order, but I think they would have made the cut. These are all really great movies, each for different reasons. I think Timmy Failure and The Croods 2 probably would have made the top 10 list too, depending on how good all those delayed films and the ones I missed were going to be. But at number 5, we have Love and Monsters. This is a movie that was not at all on my radar. I think I only heard the title of it, thanks to Rachel Wagner and Sean Chandler. I don't think I'd heard about it at all before they mentioned it, and I'm so glad they talked about it. This is kind of a post-apocalyptic action-adventure rom-com. It's just a weird mashup of genres that somehow totally works together, and I thought it was so much fun. It tells the story of this guy who has to travel on foot through a world taken over by giant monsters in order to try to reunite with his long-lost girlfriend. I had a blast at this film, and I totally recommend it for sci-fi fans, and probably even for romance fans. I'm definitely not an expert, but I think this is kind of a perfect date night film. It's just weird enough that I think it works for a lot of different kinds of people. It's just a lot of fun. At number 4, we have Phineas and Ferb, the movie, Candace Against the Universe. This is a follow-up to the animated series Phineas and Ferb, and it follows the main characters of that show on an interplanetary adventure as Phineas and Ferb have to team up with the evil Dr. Doofenshmirtz in order to rescue their older sister Candace and Dr. Doofenshmirtz's daughter Vanessa, who have been kidnapped by aliens. It is an utterly ridiculous film, but it is so funny. Now, granted, I might be biased because I was a huge fan of the show back in the day, but the writing is so clever and the music is so catchy that I think I would enjoy it even if I hadn't seen the show. I don't know if it would have made it this high on my list if I weren't familiar with these characters, but I am familiar and I loved it, so it's at number 4. Coming in at number 3, we have Shaun the Sheep Farmageddon. This is the sequel to the original Shaun the Sheep movie, which is based off the show Shaun the Sheep, which was a spin-off of the Wallace and Gromit shorts. But really, you don't have to have seen a single one of those previous things to enjoy this movie. It's that good. It stands on its own. For one thing, none of these characters speak. The entire film is completely dialogue-free, which is an achievement in and of itself. This film follows Shaun and the other sheep of Mossy Bottom Farm as they try to help a lost baby alien who has somehow wound up lost on their farm. This is classic Aardman animation, full of great British humor, and I absolutely loved it. Highly recommend it. At number 2 on my list, the runner-up film, we have a movie that was actually at number 1 for almost this entire year, until one final film came out on Christmas and stole its place as Queen. This is Emma. This was the final film I saw back in March before the world shut down, and I loved it. I didn't know what to expect with this movie. It's a period piece, an adaptation of a Jane Austen novel that I have never read, but it was getting such great reviews that I decided I'd just go out and see it, and I'm so glad I did. Not just because everything shut down right after that, but because it was just that good. It is so wonderfully quirky and so very dry and British that it wound up being exactly my jam. I love this movie so much more than I ever thought I would, and I am now planning at some point to make Emma the focus of an entire series for my Every Version Ever podcast. Okay, the moment you've all been waiting for, my favorite film of 2020. And if you're at all familiar with the slate of movies that has come out this year and my taste in movies, then you've probably already guessed what this was the second you heard that something came out on Christmas that dethroned Emma. This is Pixar's Soul. Yes, Pixar released 2 films this year, and they definitely saved the best for last. Soul tells the story of a man who dies and is on his way to the great beyond, but somehow finds himself in the great before, which is kind of like a training camp for young souls who have to learn what it is to be human before getting sent to Earth. This movie was chock full of Pixar creativity, and the art style and animation was just astounding. This film became my favorite movie of 2020 before we had even gotten to the opening titles, because that shot, I'm trying not to spoil too much, but that shot where Joe's soul is falling through the nothingness, the animation blew my mind. The music was amazing. I loved it so much. And then when he gets to the great before and meets all these counselors who are like these free-form, abstract-ish 2D, but also 3D, sort of like Picasso people. So creative. I loved everything about this movie, and it easily won the top spot in my ranking for the year. I could not recommend this movie more. We'll see what happens after I finish catching up on all the other animated movies, because there's one that people have been saying is better than Soul, but we'll see what I think when we get there. I don't know yet. Obviously, I haven't seen it. Maybe after this week, I'll get a chance to watch it. Okay, that's it. That was my list ranking every film I watched in 2020. I wish I'd been able to see more, but with everything that happened this year, both pandemic and not pandemic related, I'm glad I got to see as many as I did. Hopefully 2021 will be better. So far this year, nothing has come out that has really sparked my interest, but there is some stuff coming. Not sure when or if it'll get delayed again, but I'm hopeful. And if worse comes to worse, we always have streaming. A bunch of the films on my list were streaming releases, and technically even Soul was a Disney Plus film after being delayed in theaters all year. So streaming is not a bad thing, and I'm really glad it's an option these days. Anyway, I think that's going to be all for today. Thanks for tuning into this premiere episode of Season 3 of iHeart Movies. I know this wasn't a normal kind of episode, but hopefully you enjoyed it. Next time, we'll definitely get back to our regular conversation-style episodes. I haven't fully decided what the first of those will be. It'll depend on what I have time for. I am going to try and record that animation ranking soon. But remember, one of the first episodes this season is going to be Star Wars A New Hope, and if possible, I want to get your thoughts on that one. As I said in my mini intro episode, Anchor has a voicemail feature where listeners can submit their thoughts and potentially be featured on the show. So if you want to have your message played on that episode, follow the link in the description and send me your thoughts on Star Wars Episode 4. And alternatively, you can tweet at me. If I get any written messages about the movie, I will read those on the show as well. Okay, that's all for now. I will see you next time on iHeart Movies. Thanks for listening.